You pay with food stamps?
They laughed at me, tore at my clothes, and called me trash, all because I tried to pay with food stamps. But what they didn't know was that the man they mocked me for not having was the one who owned everything around them. And when he arrived, silence fell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell, because this story will remind you that true power isn't in wealth or status, it's in how we treat those who have none. I've never been the kind of woman who needed luxury to feel alive. My name is Genesis, and for as long as I can remember, life has taught me that peace comes from simplicity, not status. I used to have a decent job, a small apartment, and dreams that fit neatly inside a modest heart. But when the economy crashed, so did everything I thought was secure. The savings disappeared faster than I could blink, and the only thing I had left was faith. Faith that somehow good days would return. Those days did return, but not in the way I expected. I met my husband during one of my hardest seasons, a quiet, kind man who worked as a mechanic back then. He had grease on his hands and truth in his eyes. We built something together that no amount of money could have bought: trust, respect, and laughter through the noise of struggle. Over the years, his business grew beyond our wildest dreams. He became a partner in several companies, his name whispered in circles far above the life we once knew. But despite the fortune that followed him, I never wanted to change. I still cooked my own meals, still walked to the corner store, still used coupons when I could. To me, money was never a measure of worth. Kindness was. My husband used to smile at that. "You're the only billionaire's wife I know who still clips grocery coupons," he'd tease. I'd laugh, but in my heart I stayed grounded. I never wanted to lose the part of me that remembered what hunger felt like. So even when life became easier, I carried my humility like armor. That morning, the sun was soft, the kind that makes everything glow without burning. My old car had been coughing and wheezing for weeks, barely making it through each drive. My husband was out of town for a business meeting, and I didn't want to bother him. I decided to visit the nearby car dealership and see if I could trade it in for something reliable. Nothing fancy, just something that could get me to the grocery store and church without fear of breaking down on the side of the road. I remember dressing simply. A pale blue blouse and beige skirt I'd had for years. My hair was pulled into a loose bun, and I wore flat shoes that had long lost their shine. I wasn't trying to impress anyone, I just wanted to take care of something practical. I packed my old purse, tucked in a few documents, and even carried my food stamp card just in case I needed to cover a small part of the payment. When I walked into the dealership, the cool air hit my face, and for a moment, I felt hopeful. There were shiny cars lined up under bright lights, their metal bodies gleaming like mirrors. I smiled politely at the first salesman who caught my eye, but he only gave me a quick glance before turning back to his phone. Maybe he was busy, I told myself. I waited near a silver sedan that looked affordable, tracing my fingers along the hood, imagining the calm of driving something dependable again. Eventually, one of them approached. Tall, with slicked back hair and a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You looking for something in a low budget range?" he asked, his tone polite but sharp enough to sting. I nodded with a smile, trying to hide my discomfort. I explained what I was looking for and mentioned I had a small budget, but I'd worked out a plan. He chuckled lightly. "We'll see what we can do," he said, motioning toward the back. I followed him, still hopeful, not realizing that the warmth in his words was only surface deep. Inside, I could already feel eyes glancing my way, quick looks, soft laughs under the breath. I didn't know it then, but those small, dismissive stares were only the beginning of something that would test every ounce of dignity I had left. As I filled out the initial form, I could feel my heartbeat quicken. Not from fear, but from the quiet awareness that the world sometimes forgets how to treat those who appear to have less. I'd been poor before. I knew the weight of being underestimated. But that day I would learn that humiliation can come not from what you lack, but from what others fail to see in you. I could feel their eyes before I heard their words. It started with whispers, quiet enough that I could pretend not to notice. But soon the laughter grew bolder, heavier, and impossible to ignore. I sat across the salesman's desk, still smiling politely, clutching my purse as he skimmed through my papers. He looked at me with a smirk that carried more judgment than curiosity. "So," he said, dragging out the word like he was tasting it, "you'll be paying with food stamps?" He didn't even try to hide his mockery. I nodded, trying to keep my tone calm. "Partially. I have savings too. I just thought it would help." He cut me off with a chuckle that sounded like disbelief. "Lady, this isn't a grocery store. We sell cars here." The other employees nearby burst out laughing. One of them, a younger guy with a loud voice, leaned on a car door and said, "Maybe she wants to trade in coupons for tires." The room filled with laughter again, sharp and echoing. My hands trembled slightly, but I held my ground. "I'm just here to buy a car," I said softly, hoping to sound steady. But my voice cracked a little, betraying the hurt I was trying to hide. The salesman leaned back in his chair, his grin widening. "Well, you're free to look around, but we don't usually do charity sales." He winked at the others, and the laughter rose once more. Something inside me shrank. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was the sting of being invisible, of being looked at like I didn't belong in a place that sold dreams on 4 wheels. I lowered my gaze and tried to focus on the form in front of me. But every time I moved, someone snickered. Then it got worse. As I stood up to leave, one of the men brushed past me, pretending it was an accident. His arm grazed mine, not softly but intentionally. I stepped back, startled. Another one reached out and tugged at my sleeve, pretending to joke. "Careful," he said with a sneer. "You might tear that blouse." "Looks vintage." The others laughed, cruel and careless. I could feel my chest tighten, my breath coming faster. "Please," I whispered, "I just want to go." But they didn't stop. One of them snatched the brochure I was holding and waved it around. "You're wasting our time." "Maybe try the thrift shop down the street. They might have something in your range." My throat ached. The laughter blurred into noise, their faces twisted in amusement while I stood there clutching my purse like it was armor. I felt the tears sting my eyes before I could stop them. I turned toward the door, but another man stepped in my way, smirking. "What's wrong?" "We're just having fun," he said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. Fun, that's what they called it, humiliating someone who never raised her voice, who only wanted to buy a car. Someone behind me tugged lightly at my skirt. It wasn't violent, but it was enough to break something inside me. My tears spilled before I could stop them. I whispered again, "Please, just let me go." The manager appeared, drawn by the laughter. Instead of stopping them, he joined in. "Who let her in here? Look at her. She doesn't belong in this showroom." And then, as if cruelty needed a final act, one of them opened the glass door and motioned for me to leave. "Go on," he said mockingly. "Bus stops down the street." I stepped outside, the sunlight hitting my face like a slap. My blouse was wrinkled, my sleeve stretched where they had pulled it. I sank onto the curb, my tears falling silently. I didn't care about the car anymore. I didn't care about pride. I just wanted the ache to stop. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and called the one person whose voice had always steadied me. My husband answered on the first ring. "Genesis?" His tone sharpened the moment he heard me sniffle. "What happened?" I couldn't find the words. All I managed to whisper was, "They laughed at me. They pushed me out." There was a long pause, the kind that feels like the earth holding its breath. Then, in a voice low and calm, he said, "Stay right there. Don't move." For the first time that day, I stopped crying. Because I knew, when he said that in that tone, something was about to change. My hands were still shaking when I ended the call. The phone felt heavy, slippery with the sweat from my palms. I sat there on the curb outside the dealership, staring at the asphalt beneath my shoes, wondering how something as simple as buying a car could turn into such cruelty. People walked past, glancing at me, a few curious, a few indifferent, but no one stopped. Maybe they thought I was just another woman having a bad day. They couldn't see the pieces of dignity scattered around me, invisible but broken all the same. The laughter from inside still echoed faintly through the glass windows. I could see them, those same men who had mocked me, leaning against cars, smirking, as if what they had done was some harmless joke. My heart ached, not just for myself but for anyone who had ever been made to feel small for simply existing. Minutes passed like hours. I wiped my face, trying to collect myself, but my tears kept coming. And then the sound of engines, deep, powerful, and unmistakable, filled the air. 3 large SUVs rolled up in front of the dealership, their polished bodies reflecting the sun like moving mirrors. The laughter inside stopped instantly. Heads turned. The doors opened almost in unison, and from the first car stepped my husband. He wasn't a man who needed to announce his presence. The silence around him did that for him. He walked with a calm authority that made people instinctively move aside. His expression was unreadable, but I knew that look. It wasn't rage. It was colder than that. It was controlled fury. He reached me before anyone else did. Kneeling slightly, he brushed a strand of hair from my face, his touch gentle against the chaos around us. "Who did this?" he asked quietly. I shook my head, still trembling. "I just wanted a car," I whispered. "They laughed. He didn't let me finish. He stood up slowly, turned toward the glass doors, and began walking inside. The staff who had once looked down on me now stood frozen. I followed a few steps behind, my heart pounding as if it could echo across the marble floor. Inside, the air felt different, heavier, tense. The manager was the first to speak, his voice unsteady. "Sir, can we help you?" My husband's tone was calm, almost too calm. "You already did," he said. "You helped show me who I should never employ again." Recognition dawned on their faces, confusion turning into horror as they realized who he was. The salesman who had mocked me earlier stumbled over his words. "Wait, you're Mr. "Yes," my husband cut him off sharply. "I'm the co-owner of this dealership chain." The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. My husband's eyes swept across the room, cold and sharp. "Who touched my wife?" he asked, his voice low but heavy enough to fill the space. No one answered. The manager swallowed hard. "Sir, it was all a misunderstanding." My husband raised a hand. "A misunderstanding." He gestured toward me, still standing near the doorway. "That's your idea of customer service? Mocking a woman for how she pays? Putting your hands on her? Throwing her out because she looks poor?" His voice cracked like thunder, not loud, but cutting. The young intern, the only one who hadn't laughed earlier, stepped forward timidly. "Sir, I recorded everything," she said, her voice shaking. "She's telling the truth." He nodded once. "Good. Send it to me." Then, turning back to the staff, he said, "You're all done here. Every one of you who took part in this, clean out your desks. Security will escort you out." The room erupted in quiet panic, stammered excuses, half-hearted apologies, but he didn't waver. "No," he said firmly, "you don't get to humiliate someone and then hide behind apologies when power walks in. Dignity is not for sale in this place anymore." He took my hand gently and looked at me, his expression softening. "You never have to prove your worth to anyone," he whispered. "Not while I'm here." As he led me outside, the same glass doors that had slammed behind me minutes earlier now opened wide, held by trembling hands. The same sunlight that had felt harsh before now felt warm again, steady and real. I didn't say much on the drive home. My husband stayed quiet too, his jaw tight, his fingers interlaced with mine. But inside me something shifted. The humiliation was still there, raw and stinging, but beside it grew a quiet strength, the kind that blooms after you've been broken and realize you can still stand. That day, I learned something powerful. Sometimes justice doesn't come in the form of revenge. Sometimes it comes as silence, authority, and truth walking through the very doors where laughter once echoed. The next few days passed like a blur, But the memory of that afternoon stayed with me, the way every cruel laugh had turned into trembling silence, the way my husband's calm voice had carried more weight than their shouted apologies. I tried to push the pain away, but humiliation lingers. It hides in small moments, when you walk past a mirror and remember the way people looked at you, or when you hear laughter that sounds just a little too familiar. But I didn't know that our story, my humiliation, was about to become something much larger than either of us expected. It started with the young intern. Her name was Maya, a quiet girl, maybe 20 at most. She had recorded everything that happened that day, every insult, every taunt, every moment where I stood alone in that showroom. She didn't mean for it to go viral. She had only shared it privately with a friend, heartbroken over what she had witnessed. But within hours, the video spread like wildfire. The clip was everywhere. Dealership employees bully woman paying with food stamps. My face wasn't clearly visible, but my trembling hands, my cracked voice, my simple blue blouse, all of it told a story people couldn't ignore. Thousands commented, expressing outrage and empathy. Some saw their own mothers or sisters in me. Others saw themselves, the quiet ones who had swallowed humiliation just to keep the peace. At first, I didn't want to see the video. The idea of reliving that moment felt unbearable. But my husband sat beside me, his hand over mine, and said softly, "Sometimes truth must be seen. Not to shame you, but to teach them." When I finally watched it, I didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, I felt something shift deep inside me, a calm strength like my spirit had straightened its back. The world had seen the worst moment of my life, but instead of pity, they gave me respect. They called me brave. They said I'd carried myself with grace when I had every reason to scream. Within days, the dealership issued a public apology. The employees involved were fired permanently. My husband made sure of that. But he also went a step further. He called for a press conference. Standing at a podium beside me, he spoke not as a billionaire or a businessman, but as a husband. He said, "What happened to my wife is not just about her. It's about how we treat people who appear to have less than us. Wealth doesn't give anyone the right to strip someone of their dignity. The moment you forget that, you've already lost something money can never buy." His words spread even faster than the video. Major outlets picked it up, calling it the dignity speech. The comments flooded in, from mothers, fathers, and ordinary people who knew too well what it meant to be judged by appearances. But what moved me most wasn't the fame or the coverage. It was what happened after. Maya, the young intern who had recorded everything, came to see me. Her eyes were filled with tears. "I just couldn't stand there and watch them treat you like that," she said. "I didn't do it for attention. I did it because it was wrong." I smiled through my own tears. "You did the right thing," I told her. "Sometimes standing up for someone else is the bravest thing you can do." My husband, overhearing us, offered her a scholarship through one of his foundations. "If more people had your courage," he told her, "the world would be a better place." As days turned into weeks, the noise began to fade. The outrage, the headlines, the interviews, all slowly dissolved. But something beautiful took their place. Strangers began sending letters, sharing their own stories of humiliation and hope. Women wrote about finding strength in quiet resistance. Men wrote about realizing how they'd overlooked the dignity of others. And me? I learned to breathe again. The pain hadn't vanished, but it no longer owned me. What once felt like my breaking point had become my awakening. I realized that kindness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands silently, shining brighter than arrogance ever could. I often found myself sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the horizon. My husband would sit beside me, his hand warm in mine, the world quiet for a while. And every now and then, I'd think about that day at the dealership. Not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Because if that day hadn't happened, the world wouldn't have learned its lesson, and neither would I. It's strange how something born from pain can plant the seeds of purpose. A few months after everything happened, life began to feel normal again. or at least a softer version of it. The noise had quieted, the media had moved on, and the world's attention had shifted to something new. But for me, the story wasn't over. Because every time I walked past that dealership, every time I saw another woman struggling to be treated with respect, I remembered the promise I had made to myself that day. Never again would I let anyone walk out of a room feeling smaller than they are. My husband kept his word, too. He didn't just clean house at the dealership, he rebuilt it from the ground up. He hired people who had once been turned away, single mothers, retirees, young interns who needed a second chance. The new motto on the wall read, "Dignity first." Always. It wasn't just words. It was a declaration of who we were now. But the real change didn't happen in the building. It happened in the people. I started getting letters, not the kind that came from the internet, but real ones, handwritten on paper that smelled of hope. One was from a woman in Texas who said she'd been laughed at while trying to pay for groceries with her EBT card. Another came from an older man who'd been denied service at a restaurant because of his clothes. Each story carried the same ache, the same quiet strength. So one evening, over dinner, I told my husband, "I want to do something. Something real." He smiled in that knowing way of his, the kind of smile that said he'd been waiting for me to say those words. "Then let's do it," he said simply. That was how our foundation was born. Keys of kindness. We started by donating used cars to single mothers and low-income families who needed them to get to work or school. But soon, it grew into something bigger. We began funding financial literacy programs, employment workshops, and local shelters. Every car handed over wasn't just transportation. It was a symbol of a second chance, a reminder that everyone deserves to move forward with dignity. Sometimes people would cry when they got their keys. I understood those tears more than anyone else could. They weren't crying for the gift. They were crying because someone finally saw them, not as poor, not as helpless, but as worthy. A few months later, Maya, the intern who had recorded the video, came to visit me again. She had finished her degree, thanks to the scholarship my husband gave her, and now she wanted to work for our foundation. I didn't hesitate. I hugged her and said, "Welcome home." Seeing her walk into the office on her first day made me realize how far we'd all come. What began as humiliation had turned into a ripple of change. The pain I carried that day had transformed into purpose. And purpose, I learned, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Sometimes I still drive by that same dealership. The building looks different now, warmer, brighter, more human. The people who work there greet customers with genuine smiles. They don't know who I am, and I like it that way. I watch from a distance, knowing that my story isn't just mine anymore. It belongs to everyone who's ever been made to feel less, and everyone who chose grace instead of hate. That's what life taught me in the quiet aftermath. Revenge fades, but dignity lasts. You don't have to raise your voice to make a difference. You just have to stand firm in your truth and let the world learn from your silence. As the sun sets behind the horizon, I sometimes whisper to myself, maybe that day wasn't my breaking point after all. Maybe it was my becoming, because that's what it truly was. The day a woman the world laughed at stood tall enough to remind everyone that kindness isn't weakness, and respect doesn't cost a cent. It's the wealth that every human heart can afford to give. Even now, when I look back, I realize that karma has its own language, quiet, patient, and exact. It doesn't always roar like thunder. Sometimes it walks in softly, dressed as consequence. What happened next was proof of that. The men who had mocked me that day tried to rebuild their reputations, but the world doesn't forget cruelty so easily. One of them tried to open a small car lot in another town, but people recognized him from the viral video. Customers stopped showing up. Another found work at a different dealership, only to be let go after complaints about his behavior surfaced again. Every action has a price, and theirs had finally come due. I didn't take joy in it, not anymore. Once I thought I would, but healing changes the kind of victory you crave. What I wanted wasn't revenge. It was balance. I wanted them to understand that the way you treat people in weakness will one day define you in strength. Months later, that understanding began to spread. The video had started conversations in places we never imagined: schools, offices, even government programs that trained service workers in empathy and respect. One reporter called me the woman who paid with dignity. I didn't feel like a symbol, but if my story helped someone stand taller, it was worth it. My husband and I continued the work we'd started, expanding our foundation's reach. We partnered with charities that provided job training, legal aid, and transportation for women escaping abuse. Every new initiative felt like reclaiming a little more of the respect that had been stripped away that day. But more than anything, it felt like setting things right, not just for me, but for anyone who'd ever been made to feel less than. Sometimes people asked me how I forgave them, the men who laughed, the ones who touched, the ones who threw me out. My answer was always the same: because forgiveness is not for them, it's for me. Holding on to hate would have meant they still had power over me, and I refused to let the ugliest few minutes of my life define the rest of it. I learned that real power isn't loud. It's in composure, in staying kind when the world tries to make you cruel. My husband used to say, "People mistake silence for weakness, but silence is just strength under control." I understand that now. On our anniversary that year, he surprised me with a car, the same model I had tried to buy that day. When I opened the door, I found an envelope on the seat. Inside was a note that read, "To the woman who taught me that class can't be bought, it can only be lived." I cried, but they weren't sad tears. They were tears of release, of finally being at peace with everything that had happened. I had walked through humiliation and come out with grace. I had been broken down and rebuilt stronger, not harder. As we drove through the city that night, the lights reflected on the windshield like little pieces of hope. I looked at him, my husband, my anchor, and whispered, "You know what the best part is?" He smiled. "What's that?" "They thought they destroyed me," I said softly, "but they built something instead, something they'll never understand." He squeezed my hand gently and replied, "That's what happens when a good heart refuses to stay silent." The city blurred past us, alive and endless. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I hadn't just survived humiliation. I had transformed it into power, into purpose, into peace. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't fire or fury. It's a life lived so beautifully that the world remembers your grace long after it forgets their cruelty. If Genesis's story touched your heart, hit that like button, share it, and subscribe for more stories that prove kindness is the highest form of power, and karma always remembers.